Hello and welcome to Afternoon Briefing here on ABC News. I'm Patricia Karvelas. It's great to have your company. Coming up today, I'll speak to Pat Turner. She's the co-chair of the Joint Task Force on Closing the Gap after today's historic meeting. But first, here are the top stories we're following today. Revelations that thousands are refusing COVID tests in Victoria as the state records another 66 cases. Balmain residents in Sydney's inner west warned to look out for symptoms after a Woolworths worker tested positive to the virus. And taxing times. More than 6,500 JobKeeper applications knocked back by the ATO. After 18 months of negotiations, Indigenous leaders and ministers have today met to finalise an agreement on health, jobs and education for Indigenous people in a Closing the Gap deal. The outline of that agreement has now been decided, and joining me this afternoon is Pat Turner, the co-chair of the Joint Task Force on Closing the Gap and also the lead convener of the Coalition of Peak Indigenous Organisations. Pat Turner, welcome.
Thank you very much, Patricia. 16
targets, 4 priority reform areas. How much does this reflect what Indigenous organisations were calling for?
Well, the Coalition of Peaks was very keen to hear from our people about what they wanted to see reflected in the new National Agreement on Closing the Gap. So we talked to about 4,000 of them through 70 face-to-face meetings and 1,400 people responding to our online survey at the end of last year. They told us very clearly that they wanted to see the structural changes reflected in the priority reforms. They didn't discuss in detail a lot of the targets because they know full well what needs to be done. And it's going to be the political will of governments that are going to enable us to achieve much better outcomes as we move forward over the next decade. Patricia?
Look, I've read through the communique, Pat Turner. I expected to see a little more detail about what those final 16 targets would be, dates, percentages, all of that. It's not in there. Why not?
Well, because it is still a draft agreement. I mean, it was signed off by Joint Council today, which is fantastic. That means all of the ministers in the jurisdictions, including the Commonwealth, responsible for Closing the Gap, have endorsed it going to First Ministers. That will now happen before the end of July. And once First Ministers, the President of the Local Government Association, have considered it in full and endorse it, then the 3 parties, including the Coalition of Peaks, with First Ministers and Chief Ministers and Premiers, of course, sign on the dotted line, then it comes into effect. So we can't divulge the detail, apart from the priority reforms that were the subject of widespread negotiations with our people, or not, to take their feedback into account.
So just to be clear, just to understand for people watching and listening, you're saying that you've actually agreed on those percentages and the reductions, but it's just not publicly released yet till it goes to the National Cabinet.
That's right. Well, the Coalition of Peaks have been very professional in their engagement with the administration. So, I mean, we're not talking about, having a bet down the pub. We're negotiating with governments on very serious matters here. We really do want to see the structural changes, and that's what we've advocated. As far as the Coalition of Peaks is concerned, nothing less than parity with other Australians will be satisfactory, and that is going to be the measure of the effort that is put in. And targets are only a way of monitoring the progress. They will not drive the change. It's the structural reforms that are included in the priority reforms that will drive the change.
There's a consensus on achieving parity, and you say parity is the end goal, and that's obvious to all of us. That's the equality goal. That's when everyone's the same in this country, and it seems we're a long way off. Will there be parity dates for all 16 targets?
There will be indicators of when parity will be reached against each of the targets, and we're expecting that all governments will contribute significant new funding to improve the service delivery to our people, to improve their quality of life across the board.
The target for parity on incarceration rates by 2093 was in the leaked draft agreement. I asked Ken White about that yesterday. Have you moved away from that? Is that now dead and buried, cremated?
Well, that will be the final decision on that. Is how far the governments are prepared to push. That will be made by National Cabinet and the President of the Local Government Association. So we've made our position on all of the targets.
Okay, sorry
parity.
To be rude, but 2093 was in that,
I know.
right? Sorry, but can we have a bit of a laugh about it? I mean, 2093, that's ridiculous. Did you make the case today saying it can't be 2093? It has to be vastly earlier than that.
Yes, and the Minister made the case very strongly, Minister Wyatt, and many of the other jurisdictions all the jurisdictions certainly agreed that we have to do much better moving forward.
Can you give me an indication of what is better? Because obviously it's in the eye of the beholder what better than 2093 for parity. What sort of time frame are we looking as a nation to have Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians to be equals?
Well, that depends on the level of investment of new money, in addition to the money that's already spent by governments, and the way that money that's already spent is currently directed through mainstream programs and through non-Indigenous organisations. If we believe that if that is given directly to Aboriginal community-controlled and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled bodies to do the service delivery, to exercise their self-determination, we know that, for one, we will employ many more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we know that our service outcomes will be much better than mainstream or others providing services to our people. So we want to take control of our own lives, and we want to make sure that we have the resources to do that.
Is there new money that the Commonwealth put on the table today?
No, there isn't, apart from the fact that we're looking to build and strengthen the Aboriginal community control sector in terms of service delivery, including Torres Strait Islander service delivery. And the point is that that will be announced, we are expecting, at the same time as the national agreement is endorsed by National Cabinet.
And the Minister yesterday suggested to me in my interview with him that there would be new money. Is it just that it hasn't been shared with you what that might look like? What do we know about how much they're willing to invest?
Well, some of the jurisdictions are still going through their cabinet processes. We also have, of course, delayed budget processes this year because of COVID. But as far as the Coalition of PECs is concerned, we've made it very clear from the outset that every government, and especially the Commonwealth, which needs to take a lead, needs to put new money on the table. And the more money we get, the more ability we have to bring parity much earlier and ensure that our people live a decent quality of life.
What can you tell me about a reduction in suicide rates? Suicide, a devastating issue for Indigenous Australians, as we know, unacceptable levels. Is there a commitment to reduce that rate?
Well, we have to go to zero. I mean, that's the Australia-wide target in relation to suicide, and we are no different. We have to move to zero suicide.
And is that accepted at the highest levels?
Yes.
Will there be more support for that? I mean, because yesterday, for instance, Ken Wyatt's proposition is that there is sufficient money available, that it's about changing the way that money's spent. Your view is that it's not sufficient.
Well, look, you know, there are a number of issues that are not really straightforward, and let's have a look at housing, for example. I believe that more money needs to be put into supporting mental health services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are culturally appropriate, readily available and coordinated and have an immediate response. So we need more capability at the local community level to spot the early warning signs and deal with them, and make sure that there are referrals to the proper experts. That requires investment of further additional funding, because we do not have the same. at the moment, the Aboriginal community controlled health sector gets mental health funding through the PHNs. Now, we are a very mature sector. We, in the Aboriginal community controlled health sector, we are an important part of the health architecture of this country. All money relating to improving the health and across the board of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should come directly through our sectors, through our community controlled sector. We don't need it going through another third party. It's just more bureaucracy, more money wasted, and if the money came straight to us, we could put it straight out there on the ground where it matters most. So these are the adjustments that need to be made. The Commonwealth, the Productivity Commission claimed in their 2016 expenditure report that $30 billion a year is spent on Aboriginals. Well, I believe that most of that money is eaten up by mainstream programs and mainstream bureaucracies, and that money needs to be diverted where it can be directly to Aboriginal communities. If we had $30 billion, we'd be making a lot more progress than we've made to date.
What will be in place to make sure that people are held to account for these new closing the gap demands? I mean, I've been covering this since the apology. We've been talking for that many years, Pat Turner. It's been a really long time. And at that point, we got the, yearly reports from the Prime Minister. Now we're going to get yearly reports from the state and territory leaders too. But beyond them just telling us what they've done, and often it looks like not much, how will they be held to account?
There are very clear processes in the new national agreement that will require ongoing monitoring, ongoing pushing out of the service responses. We are hoping that we are going to have the political will. They will be tied by the partnership agreement that's already in force, as well as the new national agreement. So there are quite a number of mechanisms where the real hard work is going to begin to make sure that everyone is open, transparent and accountable for what is done. Now, one thing I do want to point out very clearly, Patricia, is the Coalition of Peaks does not control the monetary policy or the fiscal policy in this country. They are responsibilities of government. Neither do we control the legislation that is passed in this country. We will try to influence that, and of course we wish we did have control of the monetary and fiscal policy as far as it goes to our people and the legislative arrangements, but they remain, the power for that rests with governments. So governments have to step up and they have to deliver.
Before I let you go, you've worked your guts out on this over the last 18 months and really over your whole career, your lifetime.
Yes.
Do you feel like you're on the cusp of something real and meaningful here? What's the sticking point? Because it has to get to National Cabinet, as you say. That's the political milestone it has to jump. Do you think it's going to happen?
Yes, I do think it's going to happen. I am very pleased. I mean, this is a historic meeting again today. But the most historic meeting will be when National Cabinet meets and endorses it and commits new money, and it is very important that we see that money. If we can see all of this money spent during COVID, and I understand the importance of that, don't get me wrong, and our people are benefiting from, Job Seeker and JobKeeper and so on, as like other Australians. But they are massive investments, and this issue has been around much longer than COVID, and yet we have failed to see governments take the leadership to invest in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being able to exercise full determination and to control our own affairs and allow us to do the service delivery and to make and be accountable and to make sure that we achieve much better outcomes. And if we did it, and they resourced us to do it, I am very confident that we would be on the right path.
Pat Turner, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Patricia.
Pat Turner is the co-chair of the Joint Task Force on Closing the Gap and the lead convener of the Coalition of Peak Indigenous Organisations. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Indigenous Affairs reporter Isabella Higgins, who is the ABC's expert on these policies. Tell me, Isabella, what has been determined today? Because Pat Turner said clearly there are targets that they're going to recommend, but we just don't get to see them, right?
Yeah, I don't think there was a lot we really learnt from this. There wasn't a lot of surprises. Most of what was announced today has kind of been put on the public record at some way or other over the last week or years, really. I think what it definitely confirmed to us is that there will be a justice target. So that's historic, that for the first time there will be a national Indigenous justice target, but we don't know the details around that, and we probably won't know for some time. This also made it clear that there's going to be targets around housing and language preservation. But again, there's no detail, and it sounds like we might not have that for some weeks to come until this goes to National Cabinet. So it's been a very long process, obviously, this review process to get Closing the Gap to where it is now. And for the public, for the Aboriginal communities who've been involved, the waiting game continues for weeks yet until they can really weigh in and see what this is all going to mean for them. They did announce some of those mechanisms to keep governments accountable. But again, it's very vague. We don't really know if there's going to be which organisations are going to be getting money to make these things happen, if that's going to be Aboriginal Health Services, Aboriginal Legal Services. So in some ways, I think the announcements today probably left us with more questions than answers.
Yeah, I felt that way too. I have so many questions and they're not answered yet. On that 2093 parity target, which I haven't really been shy in declaring is bizarre. It's so far away. How could a nation sign up to basically signing up to failure? Ken Wyatt walked away from it yesterday. Pat Turner said they weren't pushing for that. Does that mean that's dead and buried, or is it something that the national leaders could resurrect?
Well, it feels like that's sort of semantics in a way, because yesterday the minister said that likely the target around Indigenous incarceration might be a reduction of 15% in the next generation. But if you look at that, it does mean that we're not going to be at parity, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in our jails for many decades to come. So whether that's a figure that is in this report or not, if we're putting forward a figure of around 15%, it means parity is still many years off, decades off. That 2093 figure, I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, it's likely we'll all be dead and buried by the time that target is met. And it was quite bold, I think, of the Minister Wyatt to come out and blatantly declared that he wanted to see it to be more ambitious. It's a very tough thing to move this target, obviously, since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Our Indigenous incarceration rate has only gotten worse. So if we look to history, we know it's a difficult thing to fix, and it's something that requires a great deal of political will to turn it around. And PK, you and I both know that when it comes to closing the gap, there's a bit of a routine that happens year on year where it seems like Prime Ministers, governments stand up, admit failure, and there's not much in the way of political repercussions, not much public outcry. So the question with this framework was always going to be, well, what's going to change the political apathy? How do you make governments be accountable? And it looks like there are measures put in place in this new plan in terms of state governments having to fess up to these things as well. But again, not great detail around how that's going to work. It sounds like, from what I'm hearing, there's still a little bit of negotiation going on behind the scenes with all those states and territories about how these practices are going to play out in the future.
And the big one, we've only got a minute left, but is money, money, money. Like, they've got to actually put the money on the table. We're not hearing about the money yet, are we?
No, we haven't heard anything. And it'll be interesting when National Cabinet comes, if they do talk about a figure. I mean, if at the moment Aboriginal health organisations receive a fraction of the money that our main public health networks receive, and some public health networks redirect the money to Aboriginal health organisations. But to say this problem can now be fixed by them, well, they're pretty small. They're going to need way more money to deal with the health issues that we see in our Indigenous communities. So they're going to need to open the chequebook, and it's going to need to be a pretty fat sum if we're going to make this happen.
That's right. Isabel, I've been lucky this week. We've hung out twice on air. I'll speak to you again.
How great's that?
It's amazing. We'll speak again on Wednesday next week.
Thanks, PK.
Isabella Higgins is the ABC's Indigenous Affairs reporter. She looks at these issues very closely for us. Let's turn to our other top story today. Victoria has recorded 66 new cases of coronavirus, bringing the total number of active cases across the state to 442. 17 of the new cases are linked to contained outbreaks. One is from hotel quarantine, 20 were found through routine testing, and the source of 28 cases is under investigation. For more on this, I spoke to Professor Anton Peleg, the Director of the Department of Infectious Diseases at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne a little earlier. Professor Peleg, welcome.
Hi, Patricia. Nice to be on.
Victoria's recorded 66 new cases of the coronavirus overnight, with 28 under investigation. If this case load continues like that at around 60 to 80 a day, will restrictions need to be heightened or tightened?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and really I think the state government's approach at the moment is really to use the data, the epidemiology data, where are these numbers, where are these cases, and really try to focus the restrictions and lockdown measures to fairly focal geographic areas. And I think that will continue. Obviously, the question is, will these cases expand beyond the current hotspots? And will the lockdown have to include other suburbs? And that will be something that will be unfolding over the next few days. But obviously a very targeted approach is the goal at the moment.
What did you make of what the Premier said, that he hopes, he said he wasn't going to make the claim yet, but it might be the beginning of perhaps a trend downwards? What do we need to look for to know that that's the case?
Yeah, I think basically we've seen one day today being lower than what it has over the last few days. And I guess he just wasn't wanting to make strong conclusions that the trend is on the down. And obviously, this is something we look at. This virus has the potential to infect, one person could infect many people. So the positive sign is that, we're not seeing, as he mentioned, a doubling or an increasing number. So I think that is reassuring. But you'd want to see more than one day reduction before you make those kind of conclusions. And I think that's what we're going to be closely looking at each day.
More than 10,000 people in Melbourne's coronavirus hotspots have declined testing during this blitz. I want to know what you make of some of the reasons. We've been told that some people think it's a conspiracy. Should we be concerned about that? Is that a widespread view?
Oh, look, it's hard to know, I think, why these people are not wanting to be tested, but there's probably a whole range of reasons. Sure, I guess conspiracy could be one of them, but I haven't felt that that's a big factor. I think there are a lot of other drivers. People are clearly worried about the impact it has on their work and their ability to make an income. So that's been a factor, and the government has clearly brought in initiatives to try and take that away. It's a bit unclear, and I think these reasons are something that the state government are really trying to work out, because we really would encourage people to get tested, particularly if you have symptoms, and even mild symptoms, they should be tested. And if they want to protect their family, their friends, their grandparents, and the people of the community, then that really is something that we should be encouraging.
This localised lockdown still allows people to go to work. Are you concerned by that? Clearly, under the restrictions, you're meant to work at home if you can, but if you can't, yes, you can go to work. Is that limited in its value?
I think, clearly we're monitoring what the rate of infection, so we're thinking about what that risk is of those individuals going to work. At this point in time, the state government have thought that risk is low enough for them to be able to go to work. Obviously, most workplaces and all workplaces should be having screening questions about whether you got any symptoms, and people should really be actively not going to work if they have any symptoms, even in the mildest of form. So I think at this stage, that is something that really needs to be looked at carefully about workplaces. But it appears that overall the risk is maybe not high enough to prevent them from going to work.
The minister also mentioned super spreaders, that there might be a super spreader. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty broad term. It means that there's either an individual or a group of individuals who have led to large numbers of transmission. And that may be, I guess conceptually could be due to viral factors. Maybe they've got a high virus in their upper respiratory tract and they're more likely to transmit, or very likely it could be related to their behaviour, so that they are interacting with a lot of people during their infectious period, which could lead to a large number of people who are close contacts and therefore infected. I think what's come out is some information around use of genomics, so looking at the genetic fingerprint of the virus. And this information has probably led the state government to think that there's a more sort of a single source type for the outbreak. But that's still under investigation, and we look forward to hearing more results from that.
The Health Minister, Jenny Mikakos, says while active case numbers may be low in some postcodes, there could be many more individuals self-isolating as close contacts in the area. Do people then need to be wary of purely relying on the active case figure when assessing the risk in a particular suburb?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the strongest marker that we have of the risk of that area. Obviously, there's, in terms of people who are close contacts of confirmed cases, they're going to be isolating, and that's going to be, proportional to the number of cases in the area, you'd imagine. So, but I think that the number of cases is probably the strongest marker of risk in that area.
And testing kits, as we know, are being delivered to homes in Victoria's lockdown suburbs to capture those asymptomatic cases. What happens if these tests aren't administered correctly? I mean, I imagine some people might have difficulty with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a potential, but actually there's data coming out now that, self-taken swabs, if at least observed and done appropriately under direction, may be as good as a swab taken from a healthcare worker. These are obviously swabs being sent to people's homes, so it may not be as good as someone observing them doing it. But as mentioned, these are potential people who may not be coming forward at all for testing. So at least that may be better than having no tests at all, to get some sort of scope of the level of positive cases in a geographic area. There have been more cases linked to 2 schools. What does that tell us about schools and transmission in schools? Do you think some of that advice might need to be relooked at? Yeah, I mean, I think schools have been a really hot topic of discussion. There are a number of schools, I think it's reported today, probably about 26 schools that are impacted and have at least, one positive case. What's not clear is the acquisition source. So many of these schools are in these hotspot areas and so are likely to come from homes with other confirmed cases. So it's not really clear the degree of transmission that's happening as a consequence of schools. Obviously, are on school holidays at the moment. But I think the state government, are reviewing this very closely about what to do when school holidays finishes, and obviously getting more details of the acquisition source. Do you think it's likely that we'll see schools, at least in those lockdown areas, close down? Oh, hard to say, really hard to say. I think it's something that, I'm going to leave to Brett Sutton to decide. And obviously in those focal areas, if they are seeing larger transmission, that is going to be a possibility. Just finally, Queensland will be the AFL capital for the foreseeable future. The Sunshine State's set to host 6 Melbourne teams. What are your thoughts on that plan to get the players out of Victoria, out of Melbourne? Is it such a hotspot now that it's just not safe to have them here? Oh, look, I think, the AFL, obviously they're striving to maintain the season and entertainment for everyone. I think that, they've been getting recommendations and advice from Public Health and Department of Health. I think, the decision-making in that process, sure, their risk level is obviously very low and they're wanting to try to maintain the season as best as possible. But, I don't have too much further to add. Gillon McLaughlin's just, trying to maintain the season of football that we all enjoy. But, it's not too much further to add there.
Yeah, it's harder than it looks, that's for sure. Hey, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Bye-bye.
Professor Anton Peleg there, the Director of the Department of Infectious Diseases at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, joining us a little earlier to talk about today's numbers coming out of Victoria. Everyone's hoping that it's now on a downward spiral, but there's no evidence yet that that's necessarily the case. So a lot of apprehensive people, particularly in Victoria, but right across the country, about trying to get this under control. Well, stick around because in a moment I'll bring you Friday briefing here on ABC News. Hello and welcome to Friday Briefing. I'm Patricia Karvelas. It's great to have your company. Thousands are refusing COVID tests in Victoria as the state records another 66 cases. We'll explore what's going on and delve into some of the other stories of the week. My panel today is Eric Bagshaw, who's China correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, but due to travel restrictions, he's currently based in Canberra, although he takes a big interest in China still. Guardian Australia's political reporter Amy Ramekis is here too, and the ABC's health and science journalist Tegan Taylor, who's also the co-presenter of Coronacast with Dr. Norman Swan. Welcome to all of you.
Hi, PK.
Hello. Let's start in Melbourne, which is kind of the centre of everything now. 66 new cases overnight and thousands have refused testing. Tegan, let's begin with you. You've been covering the pandemic through the Coronacast podcast with Norman Swan. We're seeing this outbreak now. There's huge testing, lockdowns in all of these suburbs. What do you make of today's news? Are we making any progress?
Oh, it's a bit too early to say. We know that the incubation period for this virus is a couple of weeks. So I think even with all the lockdowns that are going on, it's going to be a few weeks until we know whether it's effective or not. But you mentioned people refusing testing, and we put the call out on the podcast to ask people to tell us why, or if they knew why people were refusing testing. And I was actually really surprised at some of the responses. There were people who were citing language barriers. There's a lot of misinformation on social media. It sounds like there was inconsistencies in how the people doing the door knocking, turning up and asking people to be tested were presenting. And I think some people were a bit wary of that. And there were some people who, there was one woman who emailed us, and it was a bit heartbreaking. She's a cancer patient. She was just saying she's sick being poked and prodded, and she'd been self-isolating. She didn't feel like she should have to be subjected to a test.
That's really interesting. Well, Victorian health officials are also investigating the origin of the current outbreak. There's this idea, Tegan, I want to stay with you on this, of a single super spreader, which sounded terrifying to me. What does that actually mean?
So a super spreader is just a person who has, or a group of people, as your previous guest just said, who have spread it to a higher than average number of people. And it seems to be with COVID-19 that it's a disease of clusters, and there do seem to be super spreaders. So even though that average number of people that an infected person will infect is sort of around, depending on where you are, around 2. There are some people who spread it to many, many more, and then there's some who don't spread it anywhere. And it's not unique to COVID-19. Lots of diseases have super spreaders, and we actually saw it in the SARS pandemic as well. And basically, it's a combination, perhaps, it's not really well understood. And so that's something that a lot of research is going into, but it seems to be a combination of the person's behaviour. So obviously, if you were going out and interacting with a lot of people and spreading that virus, then that's obviously going to be more likely to infect someone else, but it might have something to do with the person's biology as well. Yeah,
OK. So, of course, Melbourne's now the epicentre because of the spike, the new lockdowns, which no one else is experiencing like this. So I want to bring you in, Amy Ramekis, because, of course, it started a huge, broader debate about borders again, and a lot of announcements have been made this week about all of that. What are the political dimensions of how this is being handled?
I think the major political dimension is going to be whether the National Cabinet holds now that we are no longer all in this together in terms of lockdowns and restrictions. I mean, we have seen some of the states come out, such as Queensland, who have criticised people who criticise their border lockdowns. We've seen Western Australia say we're not letting anyone in. We've seen South Australia go back and say we're not letting in Victorians. We're also rethinking New South Wales and the ACT. We're not going to let them in for a while. We've had New South Wales saying if you're from Victoria or from, well, particularly the hotspots, do not come visit us. We don't want our residents visiting you. but we're keeping the borders open. And then you have the federal government who are sort of saying, let's just hope that everyone can get together. We agree with whatever the states are doing. I think it's going to make National Cabinet a little bit more challenging as we move into this stage of localised lockdowns. I do not think that Melbourne is going to be the only area that sees it. And so I hope that we can kind of work out those political spats before this starts going across the country.
I want to share this tweet from the ABC's Queensland State political reporter, Stephanie Zillman. We'll put it up on the screen. She says that the Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk has confirmed that Queensland police are concerned about people smuggling in trucks to transport people from Victoria into Queensland. And I don't mean to be dismissive, but it sounds to me a bit out there. Eric, is this for real?
Look, it certainly sounds like a pretty wild allegation. I wonder how many Victorians are that desperate to get into Queensland.
Well, I'm
sure.
from Victoria. I love Queensland, but I don't know if I'd go in the back of a truck to get there. It just seems a bit out there to me.
Well, yeah, I'm sure Amy Remekas would no doubt conclude that many Victorians would love to get their way up to Queensland, where it's far sunnier than for us down here. But I think it's probably a bit far-fetched. Obviously, Victoria is dealing with the most serious outbreak in the country in terms of its second wave that we've had since the beginning of this whole pandemic. But, the numbers are looking better. It does appear as though that initial infection surge, basically through lax quarantine standards. There are allegations of hotel guards sleeping with potentially infectious guests. There were, very lax quarantine facilities at some of those hotels. That has, fortunately, appears to be at least slowing that rate of infection. So, really, hopefully we're looking at a situation where Victoria can continue to ease some of those restrictions, but no doubt some of those key suburbs are going to be locked down at least for a while yet.
Yeah, there is now a judicial inquiry into those breaches because the Premier has revealed that that's why this outbreak has happened, these hotel quarantine breaches. Early this week, the Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, said if reports of blatant protocol breaches were correct at 2 Melbourne hotels, those responsible should be punished. Here he is.
There are 2 cases here, 2 hotels where clearly there have been breaches, and on the allegations themselves, if they are correct, then Victoria should throw the book at them.
That's, the sort of federal response to that. But there is, as I say, the judicial inquiry. Tegan, just in terms of the mechanics here, we didn't see this happen in other states, or particularly New South Wales, where there was hotel quarantining. What's gone wrong?
I mean, I can't comment on the specifics of this case, but I think one thing to keep in mind with any pathogen, but especially with COVID-19, we are all victims of our own biology, and any one of us is not immune unless you've had it in a very recent past, and even that's still a little bit up in the air. So any breakdown in this really important public health response is an opportunity for this virus to get out, and that's just it could have happened anywhere, but it's happened in Victoria.
Yeah, and it's sort of Victorians have become a bit of a political football, it feels, to Amy Remekas. But these breaches are pretty serious, Amy, aren't they? I mean, we've got this judicial inquiry and the report's meant to be handed down by September, so it's actually quite quick as well. How serious is, the mistake and the political accountability that you need to, insist on, really, given it's a pretty big blunder?
It is, but I mean, I guess the answer is also how serious were the mistakes made with the Ruby Princess? And we're seeing an inquiry going on in New South Wales about, issues that happened there too. I mean, the weakest link in any response is humans and human nature. And I think we've seen that play out across this pandemic. I mean, the decisions that Victoria made may have been different to other jurisdictions in terms of who was going to be in charge of their hotel quarantine, but they were all made at the same time, and they were all made very, very quickly. It's just we're seeing the ramifications of what a different decision did. I just don't think that this is going to be limited to what we're seeing in Melbourne. I think, as Tegan said, it is a virus, and viruses spread is what they do, particularly when humans do what they do, which is not always follow the rules.
No, look, Eric, there is the economic dimension to this too. We lifted restrictions. July was the opening up, and now a really significant part of the second biggest state in this country is back in lockdown. What does that mean for the payments, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, the sort of infrastructure around dealing with this virus? Because it kind of disrupts the narrative around that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and especially for those businesses who may have ordered stock, for example, in the expectation of being able to reopen and start servicing customers, this is probably a worst case scenario for them. If they had have stayed closed, they wouldn't have necessarily had those outlays, gone further into debt, only to see that potential dry up again. So now we've got a situation where for some of those businesses, particularly in those suburbs in Melbourne, that's a real risk. A lot of those businesses are probably mum and dad operations, smaller family-owned businesses, and they'll be really feeling the pinch. And it does go to this point around the fact that the JobKeeper, the JobSeeker are still facing a fiscal cliff. That is, they're still scheduled to end in September. And we don't know what the government is going to do yet in terms of perhaps smoothing out some of that cliff. You know, I think it would be extremely unlikely for the government to allow the payments just to stop because that would probably tip the economy into another recession. But they're going to have some sort of tapering, and whether that's bringing up the JobSeeker allowance, which is the one for people who are unemployed, to sort of somewhere halfway between the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker, which is the higher rate, that might be an option. Otherwise, targeting other potential loans or to businesses so that they can start investing again and start ramping up. But it's a really wicked problem, and it's made especially difficult by the fact that we are probably going to have second waves and potentially third waves and other outbreaks in different suburbs across the country.
Tegan, just back to you on the corona outbreak and what we're seeing. I know that your colleague, your co-host, Norman Swan, has been critical of the fact that perhaps we didn't go for an eradication strategy because this suppression strategy means we just have to keep living with these outbreaks, which does stop-start parts of the economy. I'm not quoting him directly, but that is the consequence of doing it this way. How much more disruption should we expect? Amy's given us a bit of an indication that we're going to see it in other places too. So far, just in Melbourne, in this kind of more extreme way. But what should we be prepared for under this strategy?
I think we're definitely in this for the long haul. So we know that the virus is continuing to spread around the world. We don't have a vaccine for it. We don't have very many effective treatments for it yet, and we're nowhere near herd immunity even in some of the most hard-hit parts of the world. So we have to keep being vigilant, and it's not out of the question that biologically that we're going to see other little spot fires popping up around Australia in the foreseeable future, really until we have an effective vaccine or a really effective treatment.
All right, so we just have to get used to it. Well, let's move on to one of the other big stories from this week. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says federal cabinet will consider proposals to offer eligible Hong Kong residents the chance to settle in Australia. It comes after hundreds of people were arrested while protesting against new security legislation introduced by China aimed at curbing dissent. Here's the Prime Minister from yesterday.
We are considering very actively in the proposals that I asked to be brought forward several weeks ago, and the final touches are being put on those, and they'll soon be considered by Cabinet to provide similar opportunities. And we think that's important and very consistent with who we are as a people, and very consistent practically with the views that we've expressed.
Eric, I want to begin with you. This is kind of your specialty. Explain this decision from the government and why they're following the UK's lead on this.
So this is absolutely something they've been working on certainly since the National People's Congress in Beijing first floated these new national security laws in May. There was definitely a heightened awareness that there was a risk that more serious legislation was coming down the pipeline, and that potentially, frankly, very draconian measures that we've now seen, which will effectively criminalise any threats to the Chinese state, would be implemented. The government knew that that was likely to trigger at least, the desire from some Hong Kong residents to get out of there, and so it had been working in the background on plans to allow for that. Then, this week we saw that legislation come into force, and just on Wednesday, the first day it was in power, 300 people arrested, and really, I think, stunning scenes of people being hauled away for doing things like holding up flags. Some protesters were told chanting pro-independence slogans was now illegal under the national security laws. And I think that really crystallised in the Prime Minister's mind that the government now needed to step up and provide some sort of stronger indications that it was getting pretty close to offering safe haven visas. But the second factor is undoubtedly Britain coming forward and saying we're going to offer basically former British citizens. Of course, Hong Kong's a former British colony who have retained some of their rights, their British rights, essentially, asylum in Britain. There's up to 3 million Hong Kongers who could be eligible for that scheme. Once the UK did that, that gave Australia diplomatic cover, and that's crucial. And the reason it's crucial is because Australia and China's relationship is probably at its lowest ebb. We've got a situation where neither side really talks to each other at all, and anything to inflame tensions further was probably going to be counterproductive. So really, Australia needed that diplomatic cover from the UK, and will hopefully get more from the US, Canada, potentially New Zealand, to start basically proportionally allowing for potentially some of these Hong Kong migrants to come and resettle in other countries.
This is going to put a big strain on the relationship, isn't it, Amy Remeikis, as Eric just indicated there? I mean, we've already had the repercussions that we're seeing. This relationship has been in decay for a while, but this is really going to inflame the situation.
Yes, but as Eric has pointed out, and as you've pointed out, the situation is already inflamed. I mean, it would be hard-pressed to find a Western nation at the moment that China isn't having some sort of diplomatic spat with, including, nations around itself in its own area, its own region. Eric is right in that the UK did provide diplomatic cover, and you may have noticed in all the statements that Scott Morrison and Simon Birmingham and anyone else who's commented on it, they have used the UK and Canada when they're talking. We're following in the footsteps of the UK and Canada. We're in sync with those countries, and that's not. For us, that's a message to Beijing saying we are all doing this and you know why we're doing this. In terms of where trade tension's going to go, that's always going to be a really tricky relationship for Australia. We've also just announced $270 billion over the next 10 years in defence, which is also going to make things a little bit more tricky with China. Just like COVID, this is Australia's life now in dealing with China. We are a middle power. We're trying to negotiate with a country that has a lot of trade interests and economic interests with Australia, but has a completely different political system. It's going to get messy at times.
Look, this week the government also announced it would pour $270 billion over a decade into defence too. That was another really significant announcement made by the Prime Minister. Here he is explaining the move.
The strategic environment and the heightened risk of miscalculation in the region makes this a necessity. There's much more tension in the Quad these days. We need an ADF that is ready now, but is also future ready.
Eric, that was a huge announcement, and if you talk to people in politics, they say the timing was, well, no doubt about a by-election we're going to talk about in a moment, the Eden-Monaro by-election as well. Sure, it was always going to be made, but this is an influential issue in that electorate as well. How much of a game changer is this? Labor's given it bipartisan support, but also suggests, we're moving in this direction. What changes now?
I mean, I think it shows Australia's getting pretty serious about its kind of strategic corridor. Acquiring long-range missile capability is not something I think many people in the establishment would have really seriously thought was likely to happen in the next 5 years, maybe the next 10. But basically the coronavirus has just, fast-forwarded the geostrategic environment by a decade. And now Australia feels like it needs that capability. My colleague James Massola wrote a good analysis piece that, basically saying that countries in Southeast Asia, will be thanking us quietly for this measure, because it does also give them a certain element of protection. But at the same time, I think we can also see how significant this announcement is by the attention it was paid by Beijing, and that's not very much at all. You know, really, in comparison to the US or China, our military capability is, you know, diminutive at best. And frankly, it's a deterrence, what we're acquiring here, and it is a significant investment for Australia. But the reality is Australia will still rely on US support in the region. The question is whether this investment is enough, given the US's kind of retreat from globalism.
What did you make of the timing of the announcement, Amy? I know that Labor was sort of quietly saying, you know, this was sort of with the view towards the weekend. They were obviously all working on it, but there are bigger issues here too.
There are bigger issues, and there's always things going on behind the scenes diplomatically, but at the same time, did it need to be this week? Could it have been next week? We don't have Parliament for quite some time. You know, the timing is a little bit suspect, I think. It doesn't hurt the government's chances to be saying, look, we're spending $270 billion over the next decade to protect you. And, oh, by the way, there's an Eden Monero by-election on. That's completely separate. So I can see why Labor has raised those concerns. I mean, I know in terms of like what I've seen on social media, quite a lot of people were like, oh, what Deidre Chambers, here we go.
Yeah, that's right. Look, just on a story that was published today that I think is really interesting, we know that federal politics has faced plenty of disruptions this year. Now there are reports by Phil Curry that there could be another change, that Matthias Cormann, who has been in the government for a very long time as finance minister, is going to quit politics before the end of the year. Eric, that's quite a significant change. I mean, that hasn't been fully confirmed, but, you know, Phil is a friend of all of ours. We know he's generally reliable. It's big news for the government, isn't it?
It is, and I think the fact that Phil actually wrote the story that everyone had probably been talking about for much of the past year is probably a testament to, you know, I think its general accuracy. There have been persistent rumours about Matthias Cormann leaving, certainly since really the last year's election, but he has stayed on. You know, I think there was no doubt if the Liberal government had have lost last year's election, that Matthias Cormann would have been long gone. He's now, in some ways, probably restored a bit of his legacy, which was really tarnished in the Malcolm Turnbull, sort of in the transition between Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. Now, you know, he's frankly overseen one of the largest stimulus rescue packages in Australian history. And, you know, let's just say they almost got the budget back to balance. So it's an interesting time for him to be going. He's obviously been flying over from Perth, you know, for the past decade or more. That's a long time and a long trip to make every sitting week, especially when you're in the Expenditure Review Committee, which is the government's top decision-making body. I've no doubt, given his Senate negotiating skills, he'll find a pretty ready home in the corporate world, or perhaps, as we've reported in the past, at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe.
That'll be interesting to watch. Look, let's end on this. This weekend, people in the seat of Eden Monero will head to the polls. I want to start with you, Tegan, because this is being held in a pandemic, right? COVID makes this rather complicated, the sort of distancing, the pre-polling, the way that they've been managing this. What precautions should people be taking when voting this weekend? Many people haven't yet voted. That's all happening tomorrow. It's really different to what we usually expect during elections. The sausage sizzle isn't quite the same.
That's right. Well, it's not the first election to be held during the pandemic, because I live here in Queensland. We had our elections a few months ago when the pandemic was really in full swing. And in terms of precautions, the usual should apply. That social distancing. If you're wanting to wear a mask, don't feel silly for wearing a mask. Masks are a way of stopping you spreading the virus if you are asymptomatic. That is, if you have it and don't know it. And hand hygiene, don't touch your face. It's just the same messages as we've been getting since March. It's more important than ever this weekend if you're going out and mixing with people even more closely than you would have otherwise.
And Eric, to you, who's going to win?
I suspect we'll see Kirsty McBain get over the top, but in a close finish. There's a question about whether we'll actually know the result tomorrow night, because there are so many pre-poll votes. It's getting up towards 50%, I was told today. And I need to fact check that, but that seems extraordinary number of people who are pre-polling or postal voting. It is a massive electorate, so there might, you know, a lot of rural voters out there. It might be more convenient to vote that way, but that does seem surprising. And if that's the case, that is going to be a hell of a counting job tomorrow night before we know a final result. And if it is close, we may not know till Sunday.
Amy, the wait will be rather tense for both leaders, won't it?
It will, but I think it's kind of gotten a little bit overblown. Not a lot materially changes with the result. If Scott Morrison wins, then he gets another seat in Parliament, and there'll be a few rumbles around Anthony Albanese's leadership. If Albanese wins, if Labor wins, then literally nothing changes. But we have to remember that the parties have also changed how you do leadership spills, and I'm pretty sure that Anthony Albanese will be able to hold off any of those rumblings which exist in every political party ever at all times by saying it is a 1 in 100 year pandemic. What did you expect?
Yeah, and also Victorians can't vote because they've suspended the Victorian branch, so that's rather awkward too, isn't it?
It is, and that kind of gives him a little bit more, you know, cover. I actually don't think anyone right now is thinking about politics, particularly when it comes to the politics of a by-election. That's not going to change anything in the Parliament.
Yeah, and to be fair, I speak to even Liberals who tell me you wouldn't want to be an opposition leader during this time, so good luck if someone wanted the job. It's an incredibly hard thing during a pandemic when all eyes are on the government for what they're going to do, not sort of alternative ideas. That's how it looks to me anyway. I'm pretty certain of that one. I'm going to declare it as a fact. All right. I want to stay with you, Amy, just to talk about something a bit personal. I know you're like, where's she going with this? Queensland. You're a Queensland girl. I've read about 400 tweets from you about your desire to get home and being stuck in Canberra. I did Canberra for, what was it, 8 years? It gets cold around this time. Are you going to go home? Because you're not Victorian, you're not banned like me.
I'm not. I am going home. The moment that those borders open, I will be crossing over with my border pass, approved by Queensland Police and all the rest of it, and I will be thawing out in the best sunshine in the world.
Tegan, it's pretty free in Queensland at the moment, isn't it, compared to what's happening in Melbourne?
Yeah, I mean, come on up, Amy. It's beautiful up here at the moment. But one of the challenges that poses is that we still have to keep our guard up. We still have to be observing these social distancing requirements because the virus is still around, and it can be hard to not get a bit complacent at the moment because it is seemingly pretty safe up here at the moment.
Well, I can promise you we're highly vigilant in Victoria and Melbourne at the moment. I've said goodbye to all my friends. I'm not hanging out with anyone. But I want to ask you, Eric, what's the sort of scene in Canberra? Because, again, in Canberra, there's been a really successful coronavirus story.
Yeah, Canberra's done amazingly well. It's, you know, virtually non-existent here. It's kind of, I think, certainly the state or territory with the largest number of days since the last confirmed case. I'm all for Queensland, Canberra travel bubble. You know, there's not many of us, but what we lack in number, we make up for in spirit. So, yeah, right. Send me up to Noosa any day.
Yeah, I'll just stay and hang out on my own. If I jog anymore, guys, seriously, I'm going to have leg replacements. Thank you so much to all of you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, BK.
Joining me on my panel for Friday Briefing, Eric Bagshaw, China correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. He's, of course, in Canberra. Amy Remeikis is The Guardian's political reporter. She does that amazing blog, which is worth having a look at. Tegan Taylor is our very own health and science journalist and the co-presenter of CoronaCast. That's Afternoon Briefing. I'll see you again soon.
Australia has long had a love affair with liquor, but when does a tipple start to tip you over?
The main question is, do we drink too much?
Sean McAuliffe is a teetotaler.
Come on in.
Embarking on a pub crawl through our national psyche.
Oh, good Lord.
Exploring the good.
I always say it's the den of a